The Treasurer confirms a budget deficit, with Tropical Cyclone Alfred and the threat of US tariffs on more goods looming large. I'm Steph Dalzell, live from the lands of the Ngunnawal people in Canberra. Welcome to Afternoon Briefing. The federal government will refer allegations of violence against women by members of the CFMEU to federal police after a 60 Minutes report last night. The opposition is calling for the CFMEU to be deregistered and has unveiled a suite of measures it wants passed next week. So, will the government act? I'll ask the Housing Minister Clare O'Neil in just a moment. Treasurer Jim Chalmers has confirmed next week's federal budget will be in deficit. The confirmation follows news ex-tropical cyclone Alfred will cost the bottom line $1.2 billion and likely put pressure on inflation. So, how big will the deficit be? I'll ask the Treasurer himself later this hour. And former Ambassador to the United States, Joe Hockey, says it would be insane to rethink the AUKUS submarine deal with the United States. The comments follow the Labor Against War anti-AUKUS campaign writing to Labor MPs, urging them to reassess the deal. So, does Australia need a plan B on submarines? I'll ask my political panel. First to one of our top stories today. A Nine investigation last night accused the Victorian government of covering up ongoing accusations of corrupt and violent conduct on multi-billion-dollar projects linked to the CFMEU. The federal government says it'll refer allegations of violence and corruption by members of the union to the federal police, while the opposition has issued a demand for it to be deregistered. Opposition leader Peter Dutton today said the scandal was the biggest in Australia's history and blamed the CFMEU for increased house prices.
Now, we're going to clean it up, and the RICO-style laws worked in the United States and they can work here in Australia as well. And it is the most significant step that's been taken by government or opposition in recent history. It will make sure that we have the ability for the police to crush these networks. And if we do that, we can try and address the housing crisis that Labor's created in this country. One of the reasons that you're paying through the roof for builders and tradespeople at the moment is because of the CFMEU.
Staying with housing now, earlier we spoke with Federal Housing Minister Clare O'Neil. Clare O'Neil, welcome to the program. We've got lots to discuss today, but let's start with housing. The Housing Australia Future Fund hasn't built any new homes in 2 years. It's acquired or converted existing housing stock. Is there a date for when the first home will be built?
Well, Steph, the Housing Australia Future Fund is a generational investment that our government is making in social and affordable homes. Just to refresh for your viewers, we've got a housing crisis in our country because there's a shortage of homes. We're trying to build 1.2 million homes with the states and then 55,000 social and affordable homes. The Housing Australia Future Fund is an incredibly important part of Labor's agenda. You'll remember that the Liberals worked with the Greens to block and delay action on that fund for most of this term. We were able to announce contracts and projects in September last year, so that's about 6 months ago. So since then, about 400 homes have come online as social and affordable homes. I've been to those homes, I've met the tenants. These are people who would be homeless or otherwise struggling in the rental market, and there are more than 10,000 homes that are in some way through development and construction. Steph, if I can just finish by saying I understand, the Liberals are sort of out critiquing this. I want people at home to know this. The Housing Australia Future Fund will be abolished by the Liberals, including homes that are already in construction. We've got a plan to build 55,000 social and affordable homes, and the Liberals have a plan to build precisely 0.
The Coalition has been critical of the fact that no new homes have been built under this. So just back to the original question, is there a date for when we can expect that first one?
Well, Steph, an incredible act of hypocrisy for the Coalition to have delayed this program and now say that it's moving too slowly. I'd be surprised, but I've been in politics long enough to really have seen it all. What I can tell you is that 400 homes have come online as social and affordable. That number is growing each week. I'll tell you, we signed contracts for 1,400 new social and affordable homes last week. That's more social and affordable homes than the Coalition built in their first 2 terms when they were recently in government. So there's really no contest here. One party that's serious about housing, that's got a serious plan, and another that doesn't have anything new to say, wants to raise house prices and decrease housing stock.
You mentioned the 1.2 million new homes. Are you still on track to build those by the end of the decade as promised?
Well, Steph, as I said before, most important thing for viewers at home to understand is that the reason we have a housing crisis in our country right now is because we have a housing shortage. For about 30 to 40 years, our country has not been building enough homes, and governments have basically stood back and said that they're not going to do anything about it. That changed when the Albanese government was elected, and our Prime Minister sat down with states and territories, made an agreement with them to build 1.2 million homes over 5 years. That is going to be, it is a hugely bold and ambitious target, and it should be bold and ambitious because if we go back to the old way of thinking, nothing's going to change for Australians. So we've built about 500,000 homes since we've been in government, but no one wants to do this faster and no one wants to build more homes than me. We're seeing some good green shoots in the construction sector, but no question there's more work to be done here.
But are you expecting to hit that target by the end of the decade?
Look, Steph, that's where all of our government's efforts are focused on. And if I can just say, we're going into an election here where we've got a 1.2 million home target working with the states. The Liberals actually don't plan to have a target at all. They're basically saying, let's go back to business as usual and let the housing crisis go worse. We are seeing really significant changes in what's going on in construction, and I'm confident in the numbers that I see. Just to share with you, housing approvals went up 22% in the last numbers over year to year. So we're seeing some good traction here. But again, I just say to you, Steph, what we need in Canberra, if we want to see a change to the housing aspirations of Australians, is a government that's fiercely committed to this, and ministers like me, like some of the state ministers that I work with, who are obsessively trying to address these important issues because they're very much affecting the lives of millions of people in our country right now.
You've pointed to the housing shortage as a crucial issue here and to the policies that you've implemented to improve housing supply. Practically, what do those policies do or mean for someone staring down the future of never being able to crack the market?
Yeah, really important question. So, as I said, we've got a housing crisis in our country because we've got a housing shortage. For a long time, governments didn't do anything about the fact that we weren't building enough homes. When we came to office in 2022, we said we're going to make a change to this. So it's building the 1.2 million homes, and we're doing that by addressing what have been fundamental issues around labour shortages. We're working with the states to make big changes to planning laws so that more homes get built more quickly. And of course, we're making generational investments in financing new homes, something that Commonwealth hasn't really seriously done since the aftermath of the Second World War. So all of these things, as I said, are having impact. We are starting to see approvals pick up. We're seeing commencements start to pick up, but more homes means more affordable housing for Australians. If I could just add a couple of quick points, other things that we've done here, we're not just focusing on home building because we recognise that people are struggling right now. So we've made sure that rental tenancy laws changed to better protect rentals. We've increased Commonwealth rent assistance by 45%, and we've helped more than 100,000 Australians into home ownership through an expanded home guarantee scheme. Our broad approach: build more homes, help renters get a better deal, and make sure that more Australians get into that dream of home ownership.
You've mentioned rent. Grattan's new policy report makes some familiar recommendations on fixing the housing crisis. One of them is on Commonwealth rent assistance. The report says it should go up by a further 50% for singles and also suggests indexing it to changes in rents. Is that something that you'd consider?
Well, Grattan's done a really good report out today. They're fantastic contributors to the housing debate, and I always take their recommendations really seriously. I was pleased to see the report today. It has a lot of similarities with things that our government is doing. On rent assistance, we have, in the time we've been in government, increased Commonwealth rent assistance by 45%. That's helping 1 million Australian households in paying their rent during what's been a difficult time for renters. Obviously, as the Treasurer has talked about, we are looking at every possible way that we can continue to assist people, and we'll keep trying to do that. But let's just focus on the big picture here. We've increased rent assistance by 45% during the entire decade the Coalition were in office. They didn't increase rent assistance once above the legislated CPI increase.
Now, Minister, just moving to another issue, there are fresh allegations aired on 60 Minutes of corruption on taxpayer-funded work sites linked to the CFMEU. The government's already placed the union into administration, but now the opposition wants it deregistered. Is that on the table?
Well, it would be on the table if it was going to help us resolve the situation, but it absolutely won't. And if I can just step back for a second, I've seen some of the footage from last night's reporting, and it's absolutely gut-wrenching. The footage of a full-grown male beating up a woman, it absolutely turned my stomach. You know, the union movement's supposed to be about standing up for people who can't protect themselves, and I can't think of any more anti-union thing that I've ever seen than that. So it's just disgusting, and I'm glad that these are being taken so seriously. We have taken, with regard to the CFMEU, the strongest possible action that there is, and that we've taken the union out of the hands of these people who are trying to do the wrong thing and put it in the hands of an independent administrator. We are very concerned to make sure that we continue to work with that administrator so that he's got the powers and resources that he needs. But understand, I mean, I don't know if Peter Dutton actually can really know what he's talking about here if he's saying deregistration. All that would do is mean that the union is basically open for lawlessness. People like Mick Gatto and others who have done the wrong thing, John Setka and others, will just walk straight back through the front door. So it's absolutely the wrong way to go about this.
So if not deregistration, what could the government do beyond what it already has done?
Well, I'm sure that Murray Watt will have more to say about this, and I know that he's in the process of referring the allegations from 60 Minutes to the Australian Federal Police. What I just say is that for all the complaining from Peter Dutton, the Coalition sat back and didn't do anything terribly much about the CFMEU for a decade. When we came to office, we did the toughest thing possible, and that is take the union away from wrongdoers and give it to an independent administrator. Some of the allegations, as I understand it, that were aired last night actually came from the work that the administrator has done. So we'll work with the administrator to see if we can do more to support their actions. But in the end, this is the way to root out corruption from that union, and it's very good work the government's done and desperately needed.
Minister, one of the accusations in this reporting was that Victorian Labor had run a protection racket around CFMEU-linked organised crime and corruption on infrastructure projects. You're a federal Victorian Labor MP. What's your response to that?
Look, I'll let the state government respond to specific allegations that relate to the state government. I'm here to represent the Albanese Labor government, and what I can tell you is that we have taken tougher action on this union than an Australian government has taken against a building union since Bob Hawke did a similar thing to the Building Labourers Federation back in the 80s and 90s. So, I mean, there's just no question here. We've seen a problem, we've identified it, we've actually done something about it, something serious, and that is put it into administration and make sure that we kick out these people who are doing the wrong thing, and that the union, you know, is doing what it should be doing, which is actually representing workers in construction.
Housing Minister Clare O'Neil, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Steph.
Well, for some analysis on this, let's bring in senior digital political correspondent Brett Worthington. Brett, let's start where we finished there with Clare O'Neil and these CFMEU allegations. She called them gut-wrenching, but also said that deregistering the union wouldn't help.
Yeah, it essentially goes to the core of Labor's argument here that by putting in an administrator, you can get someone in to independently go through the books, to look at the organisation and to weed out the bad elements that could exist within it. Now, the Coalition is saying that is not enough and wants full deregistering, like you saw with Bob Hawke, as Clare O'Neil just mentioned there, with the Building Labourers Federation. My understanding is that parts of the law to appoint an administrator weren't there when Bob Hawke was the Prime Minister. Labor says that this is the strongest action they can take, but with it being so close to an election, it is yet again tapping into parts of the darker parts of the union movement, which Labor definitely doesn't want to be talking about so close to an election.
Yes, Labor was keen to talk about housing. Obviously, it will be a major issue throughout this looming campaign. What can we expect throughout the campaign?
Well, I think it's interesting in your interview there with Clare O'Neil, she really didn't want to put a date on when these buildings would be built and up and going, and hitting that 1.2 million house target that the government likes to talk about. So putting some firm deadlines around these things are things that you can imagine the government will be facing questions about. Now, the government wants to insist that all their housing measures are ones that the Coalition hasn't supported and they would disappear. And historically, at least in this term of government, it's been a battle more so with the Greens than it has necessarily with Labor. Whether or not there's any new ventures into this space, I think is probably not unlikely coming into the campaign. So it is then a matter of selling to voters, this is what we're doing, and voters will have to determine if that's enough or not.
And trying to cut through to people who just can't crack the market at all.
Yeah, that's right. It's one of the key issues that people face. You're sitting in a cost of living crisis where housing, energy bills, these are things that are right at the top of people's forefronts. Parents are out there are unsure if their children are going to be able to have a better life than they've had, or let alone buy a property, be it a small apartment or a bigger house. So these are definitely kitchen table concerns. Whether or not the government can alleviate those, I think, is very much yet to be seen.
We'll hear from Treasurer Jim Chalmers on afternoon briefing later, but he's confirmed today that there'll be a deficit in the budget next week. That's largely what we were expecting.
Yeah, it is. Deficit is been a long time coming. The government's now saying it out loud. Inflation is great for the federal budget. It's terrible for household budgets. Why it's good for the federal government is you've got everything's costing more, so there's a greater GST take. You've had this great situation where unemployment has stayed low, so the government is benefiting from more people being in work from personal income take, but then also not having to pay the welfare bills that you've seen as well. And the falling Australian dollar has meant that commodities, which are soaring, are being paid at a US dollar rate. So there's more money coming into the budget. And looking at some of the key commodities, they are well above what the budget was forecasting last year. Now, all that said, we're getting this deficit. Why? Because the government and the government before it have benefited from short-term windfalls, largely on the back of commodities, but we're making permanent structural changes to the budget. Things like the Stage 3 tax cuts, which cost $25 million a year. That is a cost you need to cover year in, year out. And so you see people like Chris Richardson, the independent economist, coming forward and saying, we have had this great period of fortune in our country. Why have we not done enough to make the structural changes that everybody says are in the budget? Now, that said, does a surplus get you any plaudits in the public at the moment? I'm not sure, and it must be frustrating for Labor that they've delivered two surpluses. They were said in opposition you'd never be able to deliver a budget surplus. They've done it twice. Whether or not you get the economic benefit from it must be really cruel for them at the moment, because households are doing it tough and they want to know what the government's doing to support them.
Well, I wanted to ask you about that because the media, which is us, Brett, gets a lot of criticism about the fixation on deficits in budgets. Do you think that people at home care if there's a surplus or deficit in a budget?
I think the difficult element, if you are trying to sell a surplus, you're trying to say we are good economic managers. We can keep our house in order. And that is a message that maybe people are willing to hear in easier times. But at the moment, people are potentially left saying, well, hang on, if you've got all this money slopping around in coffers, why aren't you doing more to help my household? So that's why we might see a few things like the extension of the energy relief that we saw in the last budget. Again, it's a way in which the government can target support to households without it necessarily being inflationary, because the great concern is if you put a whole lot of money into the economy at the moment, it fuels inflation, it makes the situation worse. The best thing the government wants to see are future rate cuts from the RBA. That is outside of their control. But it's an insidious position that they're in, because you're wanting to sell all your credentials, but you don't have a lot of money that you can really put out into the economy.
Brett Worthington, thanks so much for your analysis today.
Thanks, Steph.
Now, we knew the federal budget was likely to be in the red this year after December's budget update forecast a deficit for this financial year of $27 billion. Today, the Treasurer confirmed it, noting the cost of clean-up from ex-tropical cyclone Alfred in a press conference in Brisbane.
A defining feature of our first three budgets was responsible economic management. That will be a defining feature of the fourth as well. Even this year, where we will be printing a deficit for this year, it will be much, much smaller than what we inherited from our political opponents, and that shows the progress that we've been able to make.
Now, we'll talk to the Treasurer himself a bit later in the program, but first, the Grattan Institute has released a post-election blueprint covering policies from a net zero economy to education, housing, health and tax, suggesting reform in a huge number of areas. To break this down, let's bring in their CEO, Aruna Sathanapali. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, thanks for having me.
This is a broad-ranging report offering, as you describe it, a blueprint to improve living standards for all Australians. Let's zero in on some of the policy challenges you've identified and the solutions that you're presenting. On energy and the transition to net zero, the report calls for a carbon price and a 2035 emissions target of 65 to 75%. Neither major party have revealed their targets. Do you think they should before the upcoming election?
Look, In the end, the target is going to need to be somewhere in that 65 to 75% zone in order to be on track for 2050. And both parties are committed to net zero by 2050. So it's less important to get the commitment before the election. What's important is to see that after the election and then to see the policies in place that are going to deliver that. We have a series of state and territory policies. We have a patchwork of policies across the country. What we need to see is those consolidated into a national net zero plan, which will then see us through to the 2035 target and then to the big target, which is net zero by 2050.
The major parties are presenting two very different visions about the future of the energy grid. What can be done to try to find a way forward when the direction keeps changing every time the government of the day changes? What challenge does that pose?
Well, it poses a huge challenge, actually, because the nature of this transition is that we need to decarbonise our entire economy over 25 years. That takes a degree of policy certainty and consistency. It's not an area that we actually want to see massive policy swings depending on who gets elected at a particular election. We need a degree of bipartisanship. Unfortunately, we haven't seen that, but that is what we're going to need in order to deliver the changes that are necessary to safeguard our economy and our climate into the future.
This is at a time of great global uncertainty. US President Donald Trump has pulled out from the Paris Agreement. China has 300 coal-fire stations on the go. Does this pose a bigger challenge for the major parties? Has the game changed when it comes to domestic climate policy?
Look, there's no doubt that the global context is more turbulent, but the fundamentals haven't changed, and failing to act on climate change will be very expensive indeed, and it will be very expensive for Australia. There's also a tremendous opportunity here. Like, we're a country that is very well positioned in terms of our natural endowments. And that hasn't changed. So the question is, do we do this well or do we do it badly? Doing it well means setting that national net zero plan that consolidates what we're going to do across all of the different sectors to move to renewable energy backed by the right storage and with the right transmission. And it also means using the framework in Future Made in Australia to be a proper, comprehensive industry policy rather than a patchwork of announcements and different frameworks.
This report also calls for a shake-up of the way the GST is carved up. There's always calls to change this. WA obviously currently gets a minimum of 70 cents for every dollar of GST due to rise to 75 cents. Major parties are always reluctant to touch this. WA is a crucial state in federal elections. Why should they consider it now?
Well, it's hugely expensive and it's unjustified. And so as we see the federal budget move into deficit, it's forcing us all to ask tough questions around how do we afford the things that matter and spending billions of dollars to prop up the budget of the state that's in the healthiest financial position so that Western Australians can enjoy higher standards than other states in Australia and people around the country. It's not only unjustified, but it cuts across some pretty core principles of equalisation across the country. So it's the sort of thing that maybe was affordable when the rivers of gold were running, but is quickly becoming unaffordable for Australia.
The report also calls for NDIS costs to be reined in. The government would argue it's already doing that. Do you think it needs to go beyond that, and could that come at the expense of services?
So a lot of the heavy lifting on the NDIS reforms is left to run. We've had some important changes. Those are really valuable. But what we actually need to see is governments, federal and state, deliver those supports outside of the individualised packages in the NDIS, and then deliver that consistency and equitable NDIS system that we need. So there's a lot of work left to do, including actually delivering upon the changes that have been foreshadowed in the last Parliament.
On health reform, you've called for a range of things, including dental in Medicare. This is something that the major parties have not ever committed to. It would cost about $15 billion a year. Can you talk us through why you've recommended it?
Well, I think with health spending, the question is a question of priorities. So where are the biggest gaps, and where are the gaps that hurt the most in terms of health outcomes? And we can spend more money on primary care, and we should spend more money on primary care. But there's a point where additional money to, say, lift bulk billing in our system doesn't get you the same bang for buck than putting money into public dental, where we see real unmet need, and particularly unmet need in our most disadvantaged communities. So that's why we've emphasised the need for money into public dental, because that's got knock-on effects in terms of health outcomes that are avoidable, and we're a wealthy enough country to be able to do something about that.
So this is a case where the cost of inaction arguably could cost more than putting dental into Medicare.
Well, this is the thing. Like, it's artificial to separate people's health needs on the basis of dental from their health needs more broadly. It's something we've done historically, but it's the cavity in our health system.
Dental's an interesting one because it was part of a suite of policies taken by Labor in previous elections in terms of just a dental scheme for seniors. Is it politically unpopular to include dental in Medicare, do you think?
Well, I mean, I'm not confident on my political analysis on who's for dental and who's not for dental. I think the more important thing is that we obviously have to think about how we pay for the things that we want. We want good quality healthcare in this country. There are a number of different demands that are on government's plates. What we've articulated is a sense of priorities around what are the most important things for government to pay for, and what we've also articulated is a number of ways in which they can raise that money, because the money has to come from somewhere.
Arana Sathanapali, thank you so much for joining us today on Afternoon Briefing.
My pleasure.
And going to some breaking news, US President Donald Trump says he will speak to Russian President Vladimir Putin on Tuesday, local time, as he bids to end the war in Ukraine. He told reporters on Air Force One the discussion would involve land and power plants, describing it as dividing up certain assets. Let's bring in our political panel now for more on this. Greens finance spokesperson Barbara Pocock and LNP Senator for Queensland Matt Canavan. Welcome to you both. Let's start with this breaking news that Donald Trump is going to speak to Russian President Vladimir Putin on Tuesday. Matt, just to you first, are you worried about what the US might offer to Russia here to end the war over Ukraine?
Well, look, I'm more worried that the war might continue. It's probably taken something like 1 million lives. It's horrible and terrible and tragic, and I'd like the war to end. I've wanted it to end for a long time, and one of the more perplexing things I've found is the lack of any communication between participants to try and bring the war to an end. And look, who knows yet whether the discussions tomorrow can do that and can deliver peace, but we should always try for peace. We should try to talk and communicate, and I just feel that it's seemed very strange that we've drawn these dividing lines the last few years that don't even allow any kind of communication to try and stop people dying. So good luck to the President to try and do this and deliver an outcome. The war's gone on too long and too many people are dying for hardly any benefit whatsoever right now.
And Barbara, can I also ask you whether you think these discussions might bring a ceasefire into play here?
Well, it's important that these discussions happen, but I think it's also extremely important to remember the context here. We don't want to see any kind of deal or trade offered by Trump on behalf of Putin which does not honour the views and circumstances of Ukrainian people and their leadership. Let's remember, Russia invaded Ukraine. This is not a simple matter of trying to find an agreement on any terms. The terms have to be just for this discussion, because only a just peace will be a lasting peace. And I think many of us have in our mind that recent humiliation of President Zelensky in the Oval Office. And I am concerned that we don't see a deal here which suits Trump and his political goals locally and domestically, and does down the people of the Ukraine. It is very important that any peace that's negotiated is just. So a step forward, a discussion, this is important. But it's not just any terms here that we need to see for the long run peace and peace especially for the people of the Ukraine.
Let's move to AUKUS. There are talks that Australia might need a plan B in terms of Donald Trump and the unpredictability in dealing with the United States. Barbara, we know that the Greens are not in support of AUKUS, but what do you think our plan B should be?
Well, Trump is proving himself every day to be a dangerous leader for us as an ally in the past. We have had a long-term critique of AUKUS. It promises a set of submarines that are very unlikely, in many people's views, to be delivered. An incredibly expensive deal, $368 billion over many years. An attack force of submarines, which will paint a target on the back of us as Australians, an allyship now with President Trump, which cannot be relied on and is a very different arrangement than we have had historically with the US. So we don't need a plan B with submarines. We need a plan B for the defence of Australia that does not involve an attack force unlikely to be ever delivered. And a growing number of Australians are voicing their concern. People across the political spectrum who think it's a bad deal, an expensive deal, a deal that doesn't serve the interests of the Australian people and our defence.
Matt, what do you think? Do you think AUKUS has gotten shaky under Donald Trump post-tariffs?
Well, first of all, on the tariffs, I mean, it's ridiculous to link trade policy with their defence needs and national security needs. All American presidents, for my living memory, have engaged in some form of trade protection, either quotas or tariffs, through their time. Even Ronald Reagan did this as well on car exports. It's not unusual at all. And the over-the-top reaction to this is funny to me in comparison to, or strange to me in comparison to what the response was to China. China a few years ago banned our coal, our barley, our wine, and there wasn't the same hysterics as we've seen in relation to the US. So we should separate these two matters because our defence is too important. Our focus should be on what we need to defend our country. There is no suggestion at all that the Trump administration or Trump himself does not support the AUKUS agreement. Obviously, this agreement goes over decades and is going to be delivered over multiple presidents. So we should focus on that and what our long-term interests in. What I think about AUKUS, though, is it's very important we don't use that as some kind of fig leaf to ignore our other defence needs. We do need to acquire these submarines, but Barbara's right to say it will take a long time to deliver those. And there are other things we need to be doing in the interim that we shouldn't scrimp on, like making sure we've got those 100 F-35 jets that the coalition will support. This current Labor government has been using the defence budget as a way to balance its other spending, and that just kicks the can down the road. We need to take care of these issues right away.
Joe Hockey, the former ambassador to the US, said we should have leveraged AUKUS more in tariff discussions to try to secure an exemption. Do you think that would have done anything? Matt, I'll ask you first.
No, I don't agree with Joe on that. As I said before, I don't think you should link trade and defence policy. Probably our best trade minister in history, and he is from my political party, but John McEwen first negotiated our first major trade agreement with Japan post-Second World War. He's got wonderful memoirs on this, and he was very clear that he never linked the nation's defence with our trade needs. It's too important for that. I mean, the most important thing we can do as politicians and leaders is to defend our country, defend the freedoms and rights that we have in this country through our defence forces. Trade is important, but it comes second to that by a long stretch. So we should never trade off our nation's defence for that. We are always going to make sure that we are good partners on defence matters with other like-minded countries, and we then try and negotiate the best trade agreements within that. That's served our country well for decades following John McEwen's lead. I don't think we should change that.
Barbara, what do you think about using AUKUS in tariff discussions to try to secure a carve-out?
Well, my thinking is that whether you're talking about defence or you're talking about trade policy, we are now dealing with a dangerous leader. He is unreliable as a defence partner, as an ally, and our long-term relationship with the US is ripped to shreds like he has ripped up relationships with many other partners and is making outrageous, unpredictable propositions in relation to the Panama Canal, to Canada. I am very concerned about the nature of his leadership and the danger that he brings to world peace and to the nature of trade. The increase in tariffs that we are seeing are a step up from what we have seen historically. They are being thrown around in large numbers against many of the US's trading partners, and they will have a significant effect. We are already seeing it on our economy. That is not good for working people. It's not good for cost of living, and I'm very concerned about those two matters, whether they're considered separately or together. He is a dangerous leader, and Australians need to be realistic about the changing circumstances that we find ourselves in.
Now, Matt, there's been a bit of confusion today, or a lack of certainty about whether the coalition will implement income tax cuts. Are you going to do it? And in this climate, would it be financially prudent?
Well, look, it's not for me to announce the coalition's tax policy ahead of an election. I'll leave that to the shadow treasurer. What is clear is that Australians have never paid this much income tax than we are under this Labor government, and that's happening in an environment where grocery prices, energy prices have all increased significantly. The one thing I can say is that a coalition government will always seek to lower taxes to the extent that we can do so. The tax cuts that have been delivered in this term were only put there because of the former coalition government stage 3 tax cuts, and yes, the government changed those a little bit, but they only did that because they had to deliver something, because the coalition government had left that and they'd committed to do it, then walked away from that commitment to some degree. So that's the principle here, that we're always going to be in favour of cutting taxes where it's fiscally responsible to do so. I will leave it to Angus Taylor and the Shadow Treasurer to add up all those sums and see what is put before the Australian people in coming weeks at the election.
And Barbara, just on Greens policy, the Greens are launching a policy for a 4-day working week. We have a productivity crisis in Australia. Do you think that this will help?
Well, we're taking a proposal out there today to take steps towards a reduction in working hours and a 4-day working week. There's lots of experiments underway, pilots in many countries moving towards reductions in working hours that are associated with increases in productivity, workers refreshed, changes in the use of technology in work organisation that enable shorter hours. Very good for lowering the costs of absenteeism, lowering the costs for keeping and holding and recruiting your workforce. Many benefits for women, for workers who have caring responsibilities. So it's time to look at this. It's 40 years since we've seen a reduction in working hours in Australia. We used to lead the world on the 8-hour day, for example. We're the first country that did that. We are now really lagging. And in the last 10 years, we've seen very significant increases in profit, 97%, with only a 50% increase in wages. So it's time to look at sharing the benefits, the productivity out of our workforce in recent decades with workers more seriously. We're on the edge of an AI revolution, many more productive changes in our workplaces, no doubt. Let's make sure that workers who are working very hard in so many industries and workplaces across Australia get a share of those benefits. So we want to foster a number of pilots across our economy, let employers and their workforces talk about the best way of doing it and create a movement towards a reduction in working hours. It'll be good for Australian workers, good for our workplaces and good for our productivity.
Matt, just quickly, would the coalition support an idea like this?
The Greens are in la-la land here. I mean, people are having to work 2 jobs at the moment because of the inflation, the green inflation that's come from policies like net zero. Just made our energy prices more expensive. That flows through to groceries. The average grocery bill for Australians is $3,000 more for a family now than it was before this Labor Green government got elected and pursued these policies. And so how are people going to afford this? How about we focus on getting those prices down so people only have to work 1 job and just 5 days of normal hours a week. That'd be a good start. But it's just not achievable now for Australians to do that. And it would be great if we could work less. But the way to do that, if people want to work less, it's up to them. Let people decide. But if we want to do that, we've got to get inflation down. We've got to get our productivity up. We've got to make sure we get energy prices and have a sensible energy prices and stop this obsession with intermittent renewable power, which just doesn't cut the mustard. And that's why your bills, your power bills, your grocery bills are going up through the roof.
All right, we'll leave it there. Senator Matt Canavan and Senator Barbara Pocock, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And here are our top stories this half hour. Opposition leader Peter Dutton says a bill to introduce US-style anti-mafia laws will be urgently drafted so it can be dealt with when Parliament returns next week. The coalition wants the laws to tackle CFMEU bosses following new allegations of violence and organised crime within the union's Victorian branch. The Iran-backed Houthi rebels in Yemen are vowing escalation after US airstrikes killed more than 50 people. The Trump administration had ordered the strikes in retaliation of Houthi attacks on shipping vessels in the Red Sea and say they'll continue to target the group. The Iran-backed Houthis say they're attacking the ships in support of Palestinians in Gaza and won't stop until Israel allows aid back into the Strip. Four Corners has uncovered systemic failures in the $20 billion childcare industry. Advocates argue private operators enticed by government subsidies are providing substandard care, all in the name of increased profits. In the past decade, private operators have opened 95% of all new childcare facilities in Australia. ACT Independent Senator David Pocock has launched his bid for re-election overnight, telling voters he can stand up to the major parties and provide them with choice. His campaign will be centred on climate, cost of living, housing and health, all issues very important to voters. To tell us more, he joins me now. Senator Pocock, thanks for joining us.
Afternoon, Steph.
Let's talk about your campaign launch last night. How confident are you of retaining your Senate spot after this federal election?
Well, as a Territory Senator, I'm up for election every 3 years. Not something you take for granted. We had a great campaign launch last night. Over 600 people attended. We've got about 1,000 volunteers signed up so far, and I think a lot of energy. People, from what I hear, want choice. They want independence, pushing the major parties on these really big issues that we're facing.
And your key pitch is safeguarding action on climate change. What will you be telling the major parties they need to do in order to secure your support in this area?
I mean, every day is minority government in the Senate. So I've seen over the last 3 years, when the crossbench has the balance of power, we get better legislation because the crossbench is listening to the communities they represent, listening to experts and saying, let's have evidence-based policy. On climate, we have to start listening to scientists more. We're seeing what's happening around the world here in Australia, and this has a very real impact on cost of living, insurance premiums going out, huge issues with our grid. So there's a real opportunity there, and I think the thing that myself and a lot of independents will be saying is let's start to deal with the root causes of some of the issues we're facing, like housing, cost of living. We hear a lot of tinkering and small solutions that the major parties want to then sell as this is the thing that's going to make a difference, but we're not actually addressing the root causes.
How will you navigate nuclear if the coalition are re-elected?
Well, we know nuclear is a long way off. I'm not ideologically opposed to nuclear energy. Clearly, it works in many jurisdictions overseas. From what I've heard from experts, it doesn't make sense in Australia. We are incredibly lucky here with renewable resources, and that's the opportunity. And I think household electrification is a way that Australians can be saving thousands of dollars every single year. And also, when we're looking at natural disasters increasing, I was talking to my parents up in Brisbane. They kept the house going. They plugged in their EV, their BYD, ran the fridge, ran everything they needed. There are huge benefits if we can actually get this transition right, and I think put Australians and Australian households front and centre.
You finished third on first preferences last election behind Labor and the Liberals. Are you confident you can outpoll either of them this time?
We'll see how we go. I guess I've been listening to Canberrans, weighing up things. I was, committed to being accessible and accountable, and I'm very conscious that every time I vote in the Senate, I'm voting on behalf of people in the ACT. And with preferential voting and the very high quota for our 2 senators, I think we should have a few more. I'm very conscious that not everyone voted for me, but I represent them, and so I go out of my way to ensure that I'm hearing from people across the political spectrum in the ACT. And there's this big chunk of people in the middle saying, just get on with it. Politicians, stop picking on the very few things you disagree with and actually find some common ground and find a way forward on these big thorny issues that no one thinks are simple, but they want to actually see some courage and some action from governments and from all politicians.
In terms of hung parliament polling suggesting that could be a possibility, if that's the case and you're re-elected, would you work with the lower house independents to reach agreement on legislation before it comes to Parliament?
The way that it's been working, as I said, the Senate is hasn't had a majority since 2007. It's been in minority, and so there's constant negotiations there. And as a crossbench senator, yes, I'm talking to independents in the lower house, the crossbench there, finding out what's happening on legislation. There's a whole bunch of things that there's a lot of common ground, because if you're listening to Australians, they're saying ban gambling advertising. We've got the major parties; neither of them want to do that. When it comes to housing, let's actually have a conversation about tax reform. You can't solve this housing crisis unless we start to turn the ship around of a system that treats housing as a wealth creation tool rather than a human right. So yes, I'll be talking to them, but one of the things I've loved as an independent is actually working across the board, working with the government on legislation, with the crossbench on a whole bunch of issues that the major parties don't want to touch, and then working with the coalition on various inquiries, pieces of legislation that think square with what I'm hearing from people in the ACT.
I also wanted to ask you about transparency around specialist costs, because it's an issue that you've really pursued. The government is making changes so that Australians can basically look up accurate specialist costs online. The current website hasn't really been working out, as you identified in Senate estimates. What's your response to today's announcement?
It's a great announcement from Mark Butler. I think it's long overdue. When I asked questions at Senate estimates, they'd spent $24 million on a website that had 20 doctors signed up to it. That is not how you can go and actually see what your costs are going to be. And here in the ACT, we have some of the highest out-of-pocket costs in the country. And people should be able to have a look on there and say, okay, well, if I go here, this is what I'm in for, and maybe shop around for something that you're going to basically get the same service. So this is something that I think everyone's fees should be on, and there should be far more transparency. So a good first step. I think private health insurance and some of the agreements that they have with various surgeons also needs to be looked at.
This will improve transparency, the government says, but in terms of supply, there's still big specialist shortages, which means that sometimes people can't shop around. Do you think that that's something that also needs to be looked at?
Oh, absolutely. We've got our public system jammed, and people are having to go private, and as you said, there's a shortage. So we have to look at training, ensuring that we're getting more specialists in the right areas, and that's a real challenge here in the ACT. We simply don't have enough choice, and it means that we have one of the highest proportion of people having to travel interstate for surgeries.
Senator David Pocock, thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you, Steph. Cheers.
The Coalition has put out figures claiming the average Australian worker paid $3,500 more tax last financial year than before the Albanese government was elected. The Coalition's analysis of bracket creep was based on data from the Parliamentary Budget Office. Shadow Treasurer Angus Taylor told ABC News Breakfast he'd wait to see Federal Labor's budget before announcing new policies and avoided making any commitments.
Our core inflation has been higher for longer than our peer countries. We do have to re-establish a tax to GDP cap, and we will see what's in the budget. I mean, this government has hidden spending all the way along. No doubt there'll be more. Jim Chalmers, whilst we all feel very much for those who have been impacted by Alfred, Jim Chalmers is already blaming all sorts of things for his budget position and his failure on economic management.
Opposition leader Peter Dutton was pressed further at a press conference later in the day and had this to say about whether the Coalition would announce income tax cuts before the next election.
So if we can afford to do tax cuts, we will, but it will depend on how much money is in the budget, what's going to be inflationary, what other measures are floating around at the time.
For more on this and to preview the forthcoming federal budget, let's bring in the Treasurer Jim Chalmers. Treasurer, thanks for joining us. You've confirmed the government will be handing down a deficit in the upcoming budget. How bad is the budget bottom line? What's the number we're talking about?
Oh, good afternoon, Stephanie. Well, first of all, I've been saying that for some months, that the budget this year is in deficit, but that deficit will be much smaller than what we inherited from Peter Dutton and Angus Taylor. It will show that we've made some very substantial progress cleaning up the mess that we inherited in the budget. But as I've said on a number of occasions for some time now, those first two surpluses that we delivered, the first two surpluses back to back in almost 2 decades. So they will be followed by a deficit, but the deficit will be smaller than what we were left.
Treasury have put the cost of ex-tropical cyclone Alfred at $1.2 billion. What pressure will that and disaster support more broadly place on the budget?
Well, this will be a key influence on the budget that we hand down in 8 days' time. Not the only influence. The global economic uncertainty will be a big part of the story. Cost of living pressures, but also the progress that we're making, getting inflation down in our own economy. These will be the main influences. But when it comes to natural disasters, we will be provisioning another $1.2 billion to respond to ex-tropical cyclone Alfred. That will take the total of assistance and rebuilding and recovery costs in the budget from natural disasters to something like $13.5 billion. Now, you played a grab a moment ago, grabs before from Peter Dutton and Angus Taylor. Remember, when they talk about our budget, they consider things like natural disaster funding as wasteful spending. This is the reason why they won't come clean on the cuts that they intend to make to the budget, because they pose a big risk to people, including in these natural disaster affected communities.
I'll come to the coalition's figures in a minute, but just staying on the budget for now, we're expecting the second round of Trump's tariffs next month. The impact for Australia could be huge, not just the tariffs themselves, but the global consequences of them. How are you accounting for that in this budget?
Well, I think you're quite right the way you've summarised that in the question. There's really two sets of impacts on Australia when it comes to these escalating trade tensions coming out of DC, but also retaliatory tariffs from around the world. There's the direct impacts on Australia from things like a tariff on steel and aluminium, but there's also the broader economic consequences in a world where we're seeing these escalating tensions. I'll have a bit more to say about this tomorrow when I'm at the Queensland Media Club, but what we've said before is that we have modelled these impacts on the Australian economy. We expect the immediate direct impacts to be relatively manageable. We've got wonderful exporters. They will diversify. They will find other markets. But the broader consequences will be much more significant, particularly when you consider the impact of these tariffs on the big economies, the US, China, Canada, Mexico, Europe. We expect the impacts of those to be much more substantial.
Just for people not as intimately involved in the budget as you, which is probably everyone, how do you model those impacts? Is it an initial scenario of tariffs? Can you just walk us through how you're possibly managing to model something that is just so unclear at the moment?
Well, what the economists do at the Treasury, and they're professionals, they model all kinds of scenarios and they try and forecast in the budget the best sense that they can get of the likely impacts of these sorts of policy changes out of DC, but also out of Beijing and elsewhere. And what they do is they have a look at the size of the industry that's impacted, they look at the likely impacts on that industry, and they come up with an informed and a concluded view. So again, I'll say a bit more about this tomorrow, but really you've touched on two of the big influences on this budget. You know, we're 8 days out now. There'll be extra money for cyclone recovery. There will also be an attempt to quantify the economic impacts of these escalating trade tensions, and between them, those two influences will be quite significant when it comes to the budget.
Now, we heard the coalition before. They say the average Australian worker paid $3,500 more tax last financial year than before your government was elected. How do you plan to address bracket creep here?
Well, those guys have got a lot of nerve talking about tax cuts when they tried to prevent almost 3 million people getting the tax cut that Labor is delivering. And they tried to prevent 84% of taxpayers getting a bigger tax cut, or 90% of women taxpayers getting a bigger tax cut because of the steps that we took and implemented in the middle of last year. So if they want to talk about tax, they should explain to those millions of Australians why they didn't want them to get a tax cut in the first place. So that's the first point I would make about that. What we saw with our tax cuts is every single Australian taxpayer gets a tax cut because of this Albanese Labor government. It means people are earning more and keeping more of what they earn. That is one of the central objectives of our economic policy, making sure that wages are growing, which is one reason why the tax take is up, but also making sure more people keep more of what they earn because of the tax cuts that our political opponents opposed.
It seems like the budget is still relying on upside revenue, on iron ore and coal. Is this economic management or is it economic luck?
Well, a couple of things about that. I mean, first of all, we're not expecting big, significant revenue upgrades in the budget. We're expecting any revenue upgrades in this budget to be smaller than in the other budgets we've delivered. But what really matters when you do get those upward revisions to revenue is this Labor government, in a very responsible way, has banked most of those upward revisions to revenue. Our predecessors used to spend most of those upward revisions to revenue, and that's the big difference. That's one of the reasons why we've engineered the biggest improvement in the budget in nominal terms in the history of this country, around a $200 billion improvement to the budget, 2 surpluses for the first time in almost 2 decades. We're paying down Liberal debt. We're saving on the interest costs on that debt as a consequence. And that's really the overarching message I would leave your viewers today, Stephanie. People are looking for hints in the fourth Albanese government's budget. The hints for the fourth one is in the first 3. A budget defined by economic responsibility, responsible economic management, making our economy more resilient in the face of all of this global economic uncertainty. Those will be the major focuses of the budget tomorrow week.
Well, if the hints are in the first 3, does that mean that in this budget we can expect an extension of that federal energy subsidy giving households $300 for electricity bills this financial year? Will that continue?
Well, look, as you'd understand, I don't intend to announce any cost of living help that will be in the budget next week. What we have said consistently, really for some time now, is where we can find an affordable and responsible way to provide some cost of living help, recognising that people are still under pressure. Of course, we will try and do that where we can. Again, we've done that in the first 3 budgets, and we'll try to do that again in the fourth. The budget is really about managing the nation's books in the most responsible way that we can, so that we can provide that cost of living relief when we can do that in an affordable way, so that we can invest in building Australia's future, and so that we can continue to clean up the mess that we inherited from the Liberal and National parties.
I also wanted to ask you about breaking news that we've had this hour, that US President Donald Trump is set to call the Russian President Vladimir Putin about the war in Ukraine on Tuesday, discussing land, power plants and dividing up certain assets. Are you concerned about those words, dividing certain assets?
Oh, look, I haven't seen those comments. I haven't seen those stories that you say have broken in the last little while. I've been on video hookups about the budget and about other things. So I'll go through the language that has been used here. We've made it very clear. We support the people and the leaders of Ukraine. They have been incredibly brave and courageous in the most difficult circumstances. Vladimir Putin and Russia have been the aggressors here. And we've made clear our position. Beyond that, I'm happy to go through the language that's been used by President Trump, and no doubt we'll have more to say about it in due course.
A Labor Party rank-and-file campaign to scrap the AUKUS submarine project is intensifying. Concerns are growing about the future of the US alliance under President Donald Trump. Is it time to jump ship, pardon the pun?
Oh, no, I don't believe so. And again, I've got the most respectful view of people who have other opinions about this, all the way from former Prime Minister Turnbull to some of the branch members that you mentioned there. Obviously, we listen respectfully when people have got different views, but we don't share those views. AUKUS is in Australia's national interest. It also has, in my view, big industrial and economic benefits, and we support it for those reasons, understanding that something as big and often controversial as this will attract a whole range of views right across the political spectrum.
When we talk about the next round of tariffs, how concerned are you that the pharmaceutical benefit scheme will become a focus for the Trump administration in this next round?
Oh, look, that remains to be seen, and I'm reluctant to kind of speculate about that. I will say this about the PBS. I mean, this is one of the most important features of our health system. We've got universal Medicare, we've got the PBS, which means massive savings for people accessing often life-saving drugs. And so it's something that we're very proud of. It's something that we will defend, of course. That's the position we've had for a very long time. Beyond that, I don't really want to kind of speculate about what may or may not be part of the next pronouncements that President Trump or others make out of Washington, D.C.
Well, in terms of the current tariffs then on the table, steel and aluminium, Trade Minister Don Farrell has said he's not sure what America wants in terms of negotiating. How do we make an offer then in that context? What can we offer?
Well, there have been discussions for some time, as you would expect. We've all been engaged at different levels with different counterparts. With the US administration, we've made it very clear. I think the Prime Minister was very strong in making it clear that these tariffs are not the actions of a friend. They are disappointing, they make no sense, and they are a recipe for slower growth and higher inflation wherever these tariffs apply, including in the US. So we've made our view very clear. But we've been engaging in the ways that people would expect here in Australia with our American counterparts, pointing out that this is an economic relationship of mutual benefit. We have a lot to offer the United States and vice versa.
Thank you, Treasurer. Thank you so much for your time today. Sorry to cut you off. We really appreciate you taking the time, but we're running out of time. That's afternoon briefing for today. Stay with us here on ABC News. Joe O'Brien is up next.